The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, while the fog still clung to the windows of Ashcombe Hall like a grey shroud that refused to lift. It was not addressed in the elegant, practiced hand of a solicitor. It was addressed in the shaking, uneven script of a dying man, and it bore a seal that had not been pressed into wax in over 5 years. Eleanor Hartwell stood in the narrow hallway of the small London shop she had built with her own 2 hands, and stared at the crest upon that letter for a long moment before she dared to break it. Because the last time she had seen that crest, she had been 17 years old, standing in the drawing room of Ashcombe Hall, being told, in front of the entire assembled family, that she was to inherit nothing but a worthless little shop on a forgotten street, while her cousin inherited the title, the land, and every last stone of the estate. The Duke had laughed when he said it. He had not laughed 5 years later. Before we go further into this story, if tales of forgotten heirs, hidden inheritances, and quiet women who rise against impossible odds move something in you, take a moment now to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of forgotten English history. And I would love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. It always amazes me how far these old stories travel. Now, let us go back to where it all began, 5 years before that letter ever arrived. Ashcombe Hall rose out of the Hampshire countryside, the way a judgment rises out of silence, grey, immovable, and utterly certain of itself. Its towers had watched over 4 generations of the Hartwell family, and its halls had absorbed the quiet weeping of at least as many women who had learned, one way or another, that a great house belongs to its heirs and never to its daughters. Eleanor was 17 when her father died. He had been the younger brother of the Duke of Ashcombe, a gentle, bookish man who had never wanted the title, never resented not having it, and had raised his only daughter to believe that kindness mattered more than rank. When the fever took him in the space of 11 days, it took with it the only shield Eleanor had ever known against the rest of her family. She did not know then that her father's death would be treated, by the rest of the household, less as a tragedy than as an inconvenience to be tidied away. The Duke, her uncle, Lord Reginald Hartwell, 7th Duke of Ashcombe, summoned the family into the drawing room 3 weeks after the funeral. Eleanor remembered the smell of beeswax polish and cold tea. She remembered the way her aunt, the Duchess, would not meet her eyes. She remembered her cousin Percival lounging by the window with the faint, satisfied smile of a man who already knew what was about to happen. Your father, the Duke said, without preamble, left no fortune of consequence. As you are aware, the estate passes entire to Percival, as is proper and as English law demands. Eleanor said nothing. She had expected as much. However, the Duke continued, and here was the moment the whole household would remember for years afterward. I am not a man who leaves family destitute. There is a small property in London, a shop, worthless by any accounting, situated on a dying street, in a building that has not turned a profit in a decade. But it is yours, Eleanor. Consider it my charity. Laughter rippled through the room, not cruel laughter, exactly, worse than that. Amused laughter. The laughter of people who found the very idea of Eleanor owning a shop faintly ridiculous, faintly beneath their notice. Give her the worthless shop, the Duke said again, as though repeating a joke to make certain everyone had caught it, and turned back to his brandy. She did not cry in that room. She would not give them the satisfaction. But that night, alone in the small guest chamber she had been assigned, for she was, after all, no longer truly welcome in a house that was no longer truly hers, Eleanor Hartwell sat by a single candle and made herself a quiet promise. She did not know then that the shop she had been handed as an insult would one day become the very thing that unmade the family that had discarded her. She only knew, in that moment, that she had nothing left to lose, and a woman with nothing left to lose is. Whether the aristocracy of England ever cared to admit it, one of the most dangerous forces in the world. The shop stood on Candle Lane, a narrow, crooked street in a forgotten corner of London where the fog seemed to settle permanently between the buildings and never quite lift. The windows were grimed with years of neglect. The sign above the door, Hartwell & Sons, Fine Goods, had not been repainted since before Eleanor was born. And no one currently living could say with certainty who the Sons had ever been. When she arrived with her single trunk and the few coins her father had left her, the street greeted her with the particular silence of a place that had given up expecting anything good to happen to it. An old woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who kept a modest bakery 2 doors down, was the first to speak to her. "You're the Duke's niece, then, Mrs." Pruitt said, arms folded, eyeing Eleanor's fine but faded morning dress. "Come to see the ruin they gave you." "I've come to live in it," Eleanor said. Mrs. Pruitt's eyebrows rose so high they nearly vanished beneath her cap. "Live in it?" "Well, that's a first for this street." She did not know then that Mrs. Pruitt would become the closest thing to family she had left. The shop itself was worse than she had feared. The roof leaked in 3 places. The shelves were bowed and dusty, most of them empty, save for a few cracked porcelain figures and bolts of fabric so faded their original colour could only be guessed at. The back room held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small iron stove that coughed more smoke than heat. For the first month, Eleanor did not sleep so much as endure the nights. She scrubbed floors until her hands bled. She patched the roof herself, having watched a roofer once as a girl and reasoning that necessity would teach her the rest. She sold what little she could, her mother's old brooch, a set of silver spoons her father had left her, anything that might buy a week's worth of bread and coal. The other shopkeepers on Candle Lane watched her with a mixture of pity and mild amusement. No one expected the Duke's cast-off niece to last the winter. She did not know then that it was precisely this: being underestimated, being dismissed, being invisible to people who mattered. That would become the greatest advantage she had ever possessed. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from a single loss, but from 1,000 small humiliations stacked one atop another. The neighbour who does not return your greeting, the tradesman who assumes you cannot pay, the family who does not write. Eleanor felt each of these keenly. There were nights she wept quietly into a thin blanket, missing her father so fiercely it felt like a physical wound, wondering whether she had been foolish to refuse the small allowance the Duke had grudgingly offered in place of any real inheritance, an allowance that would have required her, in exchange, to disappear quietly from society and never speak the Hartwell name again. She had refused it. Even in her lowest hour, some stubborn ember in her had refused it. "You could have taken the money, Mrs." Pruitt said to her once, watching Eleanor patch a broken window with an old bit of oilcloth in the January cold. "Would have been easier." "Easier isn't always right," Eleanor answered. Mrs. Pruitt studied her for a long moment, and something in her weathered face softened. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." But the truth hidden inside that shop was far more important than either of them yet understood. For in the back room, behind a loose panel that Eleanor discovered quite by accident while attempting to fix a persistent drought, there sat a small locked box, tucked away, forgotten, coated in years of dust. It bore no name, only a single engraved initial, H. She did not open it that first winter. She did not even have the strength to be curious. Survival occupied every hour of every day. But she kept it, and some quiet instinct told her, though she could not have said why, that she ought to keep it very, very safe. By the 2nd year, the shop had begun, slowly, to change. Eleanor was not a merchant by training, but she was observant, careful, and possessed of the particular resourcefulness that only true desperation can teach. She noticed that Candle Lane, though poor, sat only a quarter-mile from the new omnibus route recently extended through that part of London. She noticed that the neighbouring streets, once equally forgotten, had begun, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to see new foot traffic. She began stocking practical goods instead of the fine, useless trinkets her uncle's family had once dealt in: thread, tools, honest cloth, small necessities that working families could actually afford. She kept her prices fair. She kept her books with an honesty that startled the few tradesmen who dealt with her. Slowly, the shop began, for the first time in a decade, to turn something that resembled a profit. It was in the third year that the old clerk came. His name was Mr. Josiah Fenn, a stooped, soft-spoken man who had once, many years ago, long before Eleanor was born, kept the books for Hartwell & Sons, back when the shop had been a respectable concern under her grandfather's ownership. He had heard, through the slow grapevine of old London tradesmen, that a Hartwell had returned to Candle Lane, and something like loyalty, or perhaps simple curiosity, had brought him to her door. "I did not know there was a Hartwell left who cared to keep the name," he said, standing hesitantly in her doorway, hat in his weathered hands. "There is one," Eleanor said, though the rest of the family would rather forget it. Mr. Fenn's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a wince. "Your grandfather would be sorry to hear that. He was a proud man, but not an unkind one. Not like—" He stopped himself. "Not like my uncle," Eleanor finished quietly. Mr. Fenn said nothing, which told her everything. Over the following weeks, Mr. Fenn returned several times, and slowly, carefully, Eleanor began to piece together a history of the shop that no one in the grand rooms of Ashcombe Hall had ever bothered to tell her. She did not know then that Candle Lane held a secret her uncle had spent 20 years trying to bury. It was Mr. Fenn who finally asked, one grey afternoon over tea, whether the old locked box still existed, the one that had belonged to her grandfather, kept hidden behind the back room panel. Eleanor's breath caught. "How do you know of it?" "Because I helped hide it, Mr. Fenn said quietly. "The night before your grandfather died." That evening, for the first time, Eleanor took a small iron key, one she had found years earlier, sewn into the lining of her father's old travelling coat, a key she had never known the purpose of, and fitted it into the lock of the dusty box behind the panel. It turned. Inside, wrapped in yellowed oilcloth, lay a bundle of documents that would in time unravel everything. There were old surveyor's papers, a set of deeds, and, most curious of all, a private ledger in her grandfather's own hand, recording a series of quiet, careful land purchases made decades earlier, purchases stretching along a forgotten stretch of the Thames riverbank, purchases that at the time must have seemed like the foolish sentimentality of an old man buying up worthless mudflats no one else wanted. No one in the household at Ashcombe Hall knew that those mudflats sat directly along the proposed route of the new Metropolitan Railway extension currently being debated, in hushed and careful tones within the private rooms of London's most powerful investors. And no one knew, not yet, that the deeds to every inch of that riverbank land had never actually passed to the Duke at all. They had passed, quietly, legally, and entirely by accident of a will no one had ever properly read, to whoever held ownership of the shop on Candle Lane. To Eleanor. It took Mr. Fenn and a cautious young solicitor named Mr. Aldous Gray the better part of 8 months to confirm what the old ledger suggested. Land law was slow, deliberate, unglamorous work, nothing like the swift revelations of a courtroom drama. But piece by piece, document by document, the truth assembled itself with the quiet inevitability of a rising tide. Eleanor's grandfather, the 5th Duke, had been a shrewd and private man in his final years, far shrewder than his son, the current Duke, had ever given him credit for. Fearing that his own heir, Reginald, possessed neither the patience nor the character to manage certain delicate investments wisely, he had deliberately separated a portion of his estate, the riverside land, and the modest London shop that legally anchored its ownership, into a private holding tied not to the dukedom itself, but to whichever Hartwell descendant came to personally hold the deed to the shop on Candle Lane. It was never meant to be a punishment. It was meant to be a safeguard, a quiet inheritance set aside for whichever Hartwell needed it most, hidden in plain sight, inside a shop deliberately described, in the will's own careful language, as being of no apparent value. The old Duke had known his son well enough to guess that Reginald, faced with a shop no one wanted, would give it away without a second glance, precisely to whichever relative he least valued, and therefore precisely to whoever most needed rescuing. She did not know then, but she would understand it fully within the year, that her grandfather had, in his own quiet way, reached across the grave to protect her. But there was a darker thread woven through the ledger as well. Buried among the old surveys was a second document, a letter, dated some 15 years earlier, written in the current Duke's own hand to his father, the 5th Duke, pleading with him to sign over control of the riverside land immediately, before that troublesome parcel becomes worth anything at all. The old Duke had refused, and in his refusal, scrawled in the margin of his own private journal, which Mr. Fenn had also carefully preserved, he had written a single line that struck Eleanor like a physical blow when she first read it. Reginald wants only what serves Reginald. I fear for whoever inherits under him. Let the shop protect them, if I cannot. Her uncle had known, or at least suspected, for 15 years, that the land might one day hold real value. And when the moment came to dispose of an inconvenient, grieving 17-year-old niece, he had handed her that very land, not out of charity, as he had claimed, but because he believed it worthless, and because giving it to her cost him nothing while making him appear, to the rest of the family, generous. He had laughed, that day in the drawing-room, at his own cleverness. He did not know he was laughing at his own undoing. Which brings us back to that Tuesday morning, 5 years after a 17-year-old girl had been handed a worthless shop and told, in front of her assembled family, to be grateful for it. The Metropolitan Railway Company's plans had by then become public knowledge, and with them, the value of every scrap of land along the proposed riverside route had risen beyond anything even Eleanor's careful solicitor had predicted. Quiet offers had begun arriving at Candle Lane, first modest, then increasingly desperate, from investors eager to secure the final parcels needed to complete the line. Eleanor, guided by Mr. Gray's careful counsel, had sold nothing yet. She understood, by then, the value of patience. The Duke, meanwhile, had made a series of increasingly reckless investments of his own, gambling, as proud men sometimes do, on ventures he did not fully understand. Certain that his name and title would always be sufficient collateral against failure. When several of those ventures collapsed within the same disastrous season, Ashcombe Hall itself, the grand house, the very stones her family had lived beneath for 4 generations, found itself quietly, catastrophically, in debt. There was, in the end, only one piece of nearby land valuable enough, and available enough, to save it. The letter that arrived that Tuesday morning was not from the Duke himself. Pride, even in ruin, would not permit that, but from the Duchess, her aunt, whose handwriting had aged and thinned with the years, and whose words, for the first time in Eleanor's memory, carried no trace of superiority at all. Eleanor. It read, I will not pretend the years have been kind between us, nor that I have earned the right to ask anything of you. But your uncle is gravely ill, and the estate, the house your father loved, whatever quarrel he had with it, faces ruin. We have heard what has become of the shop on Candle Lane. I do not ask you to forgive us. I ask only that you consider what remains of this family before it is entirely lost." Eleanor sat with that letter for a long time. She thought of the drawing room 5 years earlier and the laughter that had followed her out of it. She thought of the cold winters on Candle Lane, the roof she had patched with her own hands, the nights she had gone hungry rather than beg for the allowance that would have erased her name. She thought of Mrs. Pruitt, who had become, in every way that mattered, more her family than the Hartwells at Ashcombe Hall had ever been. And she thought of her grandfather's quiet words, written in the margin of a journal he never expected anyone else to read: "Let the shop protect them, if I cannot." She did not go to Ashcombe Hall seeking revenge. That, perhaps, is the detail that surprised everyone who later heard the story: the shopkeepers of Candle Lane, the solicitors of London, even the Duke himself, when at last they stood face to face in the very drawing room where she had once been laughed at. She went instead with a proposal. She would not simply hand over the land, but she would invest in the estate's recovery, on her own terms, under her own name, with her own solicitors' careful contracts protecting every shilling, in exchange for something the Duke had never once, in 17 years, been willing to give her: acknowledgement, a place, publicly and permanently restored as a Hartwell in full standing, not out of charity, not as an afterthought, but as an equal. The Duke, weakened by illness and humbled by ruin, agreed. It was not forgiveness, not entirely. Some wounds, Eleanor had come to understand, do not close so easily, nor should they be expected to. But it was something quieter, and in its way, more powerful than revenge. It was the simple, undeniable fact of her own worth, finally seen by the very people who had once dismissed her, not because they had changed their minds out of kindness, but because she had made it impossible for them to look away. The shop on Candle Lane still stands today, though it has long since ceased to be merely a shop. Eleanor kept it, refused every offer to sell it outright, and it remains, to this day, the quiet, unglamorous heart of everything she built afterward. She often told those who asked that she kept it not for sentimental reasons, though there was sentiment enough in it, but as a reminder that value is not always visible to those who do the valuing, that the things dismissed as worthless are very often simply misunderstood, and that patience, quiet dignity, and honest work can, in time, outlast even the cruelest laughter of a drawing room. Mrs. Pruitt lived long enough to see the street renamed in the Hartwell family's honour, though she always insisted, with a dry laugh, that it ought rightly to be called Eleanor's Lane, and no one who knew the story ever much disagreed. As for the Duke, he lived another 3 years after that Tuesday morning letter, long enough to see the estate restored, and long enough, some said, to finally understand what his own father had seen in a granddaughter he had once dismissed without a second thought. She did not know, on that cold morning she first arrived on Candle Lane, with nothing but a single trunk and a father's memory to comfort her, that she was walking not into ruin, but into the quiet beginning of everything she would one day become. And perhaps that is the truest lesson buried inside this old, half-forgotten chapter of English aristocratic history, that the world will often try to tell you what you are worth in loud rooms with careless laughter before you have ever had the chance to prove them wrong. But true worth is rarely decided in a single afternoon. Sometimes it takes 5 long years and a locked box behind a dusty panel for the truth to finally be told. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe for more forgotten tales of aristocratic England, and don't forget, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It means more than you know to see just how far these old stories travel. Thank you for listening, and until the next chapter, take care of yourselves.